Hello, my name is Maddie. My family didn't just betray me once. They built an entire lie to erase me from my own life. They stole my inheritance, twisted my service into shame, and stood in court calling me unstable. I sat there wondering, how could the people who raised me become the ones determined to destroy me? What truth were they so desperate to bury? And what would happen when I finally dug it up? The day began like so many others in Colorado: crisp mountain air, a thin veil of frost melting off the lawns, and the pale sun stretching across the quiet cul-de-sac where I lived. I had just returned from my morning run, still in my Army fitness shirt, sweat cooling on my skin. My name is Maddie, Captain Madeline Torres, United States Army. I'm 34 years old, a woman who has spent most of her adult life in uniform, training soldiers, standing on bases half a world away, and carrying the kind of discipline that never quite leaves your bones. People often mistake my quiet for weakness, but the truth is I've learned to hold my ground without raising my voice. I'm not the kind to collapse under pressure. I've faced desert heat, midnight patrols, and commanders who expected more than I thought I could give. I am not a stranger to hardship. But nothing in my military training could have prepared me for the kind of ambush that came waiting in my own kitchen. The house where I lived wasn't extravagant, just a modest suburban home outside Denver, gifted to me by my parents years ago after I left the service. At least, that's how they framed it back then, a gift, a gesture of support. But even gifts in my family often came with invisible strings. When I stepped through the door that late afternoon, I wasn't expecting company. What I found instead was a note. It sat on the kitchen island, perfectly centered, the way my parents always insisted on order. No stray corners, no messy handwriting. The letters were neat, formal, like something typed up at a law office. The wedding is canceled. You'll hear from our attorney, Mom and Dad. That was it. No explanation, no phone call. Not even the courtesy of a conversation. Just 10 words sharp enough to cut through every memory of family I still clung to. I stood there barefoot, my running shoes half untied, staring at the paper. For a moment the room seemed to fold inward, the refrigerator's hum louder than it should be, the tick of the wall clock almost mocking. 1,000 thoughts rushed through me. My parents had always struggled to accept who I became. They despised my military career, thought I was throwing away a respectable future. At my father's funeral, they posed for photos with everyone else but asked me to step aside. "The uniform doesn't fit this family picture," my mother had whispered. I had swallowed the sting back then, but the scar never healed. Now this. Canceling my wedding with the flick of a pen, reducing me to a line item in a legal dispute. The instinct, the daughter's instinct, was to pick up the phone, to demand answers, to cry. But the soldier in me took over. I steadied my breath, clenched my jaw, and refused to give them what they expected. They wanted me broken. They wanted me small. Instead, I crossed to my laptop, flipped it open, and pulled up the real estate portal. My fingers moved on autopilot, but my mind was sharp, focused. The deed of this house, my house, was still tied to the family trust. A trust they controlled. A trust they could threaten. As the legal documents loaded on the screen, I caught my own reflection in the dark glass. Tired eyes, strong shoulders, a woman who had fought for her country but now had to fight for herself. "If they want a war," I whispered to the empty kitchen, "then they'll get one." And with that, the battlefield shifted. From deserts overseas to the heart of my own family. I sat at my desk with the note beside me, its cold words still cutting through the silence of the house. My laptop glowed faintly, casting shadows across the papers scattered in front of me. I could have called my parents, demanded an explanation, begged for a conversation, but I already knew how that would go. I'd done enough begging in my life. Instead, I reached for the phone and scrolled to a name I hadn't called in years: Daniel Brooks. We'd served together overseas. Back then, he was the guy who always had my back in the worst firefights. Now, he was a lawyer in Denver. If there was anyone who could help me navigate this mess, it was him. The line clicked. "Maddie?" His voice carried warmth, surprise, and then sharpened into focus as soon as I said his name. "Daniel, I need your help." There was a pause. Talk to me. I told him everything, the note on the kitchen counter, the blunt cancellation of the wedding, the threat of legal action. My voice stayed steady, but inside, every word tasted like betrayal. I expected him to react the way most people did when they heard stories about my family, with disbelief or polite dismissal. But Daniel didn't question me. He just listened. "All right," he said after a beat. "Let's start with the property. That house in Colorado Springs. You said they gifted it to you after you left the army, right?" "Right. It's tied to the family trust, but it's in my name. At least it was supposed to be." "Okay, hold on a second." I heard the clacking of keys on his end. "Let me check the filings." I stared at the wall as I waited, my fingers drumming on the desk. It was the same rhythm I'd used years ago, waiting in silence for an intel update in the desert. Then Daniel's voice came back, heavier now. "Maddie, I don't know how to say this, but your parents already filed a notice. They've challenged your claim to the property." "It looks like they did this days ago." The words hit me like a body blow. I closed my eyes. So the note wasn't a sudden outburst. It was a step in a plan. They hadn't just acted out of anger. They'd been preparing this move long before I ever read their damn words. "They've been planning to erase me," I whispered. "Maddie," Daniel said gently, "this isn't over. We'll fight it. But you need to be ready. They've made their opening move." His words pulled me back into focus. My training rose like muscle memory. In the military, you don't collapse after the first shot. You steady your breath, anticipate, prepare. This was no different. "I'm not folding," I said. "If they want a war, they'll get one." "That's the Maddie I remember," Daniel replied, a touch of pride in his tone. "Here's what I need you to do. Gather every document you can. Trust paperwork, your service records, anything that shows the house was meant for you. Letters from your dad, too. Especially those." "I'll get it done." "Good. Meet me at my office tomorrow morning. Early." After we hung up, I moved quickly, printer humming, files stacking, my hands steady. Every sheet I pulled felt like loading ammo. It wasn't panic. It was procedure. I'd been here before, in different uniforms, under different circumstances. When I finally leaned back, the files sat in neat piles, ready for battle. I reached to close the laptop, then stopped. An unread email blinked at the top of my inbox. Sender: a law firm I didn't recognize. Subject line: Notice of intent to revoke property transfer. My pulse quickened, but my hands stayed still. I opened the email, its legal jargon blurring into one message. This was more than a threat. It was a declaration. I let the screen's glow settle over me, breathing slow and even. My parents had fired the first bullet. I wasn't going down quietly. This was only the beginning. The drive into Denver felt too calm for the war sitting in the passenger seat beside me. A slim file folder, stuffed with trust papers, letters, and military records, rode on the cracked leather of my truck's seat. The morning air outside was crisp, the mountains etched sharp against a pale sky, as if the world wanted to remind me of order and clarity. But inside, my chest carried the chaos my family had lit like a fuse. I parked in front of Daniel's office, a mid-rise brick building with tall glass doors that mirrored the light. As soon as I stepped inside, the receptionist greeted me with a warmth that felt foreign. "Colonel Maddie Thorne, right this way." The words carried weight. Rank still mattered here. Respect still existed here. For one disorienting second, I almost forgot that in my parents' eyes, I wasn't worth a name at all. Daniel's office smelled faintly of coffee and leather. He rose when I entered, tall, broad-shouldered, his hair now streaked with gray. Once we'd stood side by side in dust and heat, rifles in hand. Today he had a tie knotted around his neck and a legal pad waiting on the desk. "Madeline," he said, his tone grounding me like the snap of a salute. "Sit. Let's look at what we're dealing with." He spread my documents out in neat rows, tapping one page with his pen. "The house in Colorado Springs is listed in the family trust. Your parents' attorney is going to argue it was a conditional transfer. a gift dependent on, well, staying in their good graces. They'll frame it as a revocable arrangement. I leaned forward, scanning the legalese, my mind clicking through it like a mission briefing. But they handed me the deed, I said. I've been paying taxes, maintaining it. Doesn't matter if they claim intent, Daniel replied. Intent is slippery. They'll say it wasn't meant to be permanent. A chill prickled down my spine. My parents hadn't scribbled a note in anger. They'd architected this move long before ink hit paper. I reached into the folder, pulling out a bundle of letters. These, I said, laying them flat. The handwriting was my father's, steady even in his final years. One letter in particular. This house is yours now. I want you to have a place of your own, after serving so long away from home. Daniel picked it up, his brows lifting slightly. These are gold. They're not just sentimental. They're acknowledgement, intent in black and white. If your dad put it in writing, it's strong evidence. For a moment, my throat tightened. Dad had been my anchor, even when Mom's silence cut like glass. His voice on the page felt like a lifeline thrown across the chasm. Then Daniel slid another document across the table. But there's more. His voice was measured, but the way he paused told me this was the real hit. I scanned the affidavit before he even explained. The name at the bottom burned hotter than the words above it, filed by Anna Thorne, my sister. Her sworn statement claimed I had misunderstood, that the property was never intended as inheritance but only a temporary arrangement. She'd called me confused, maybe even manipulative. My pulse thudded against my ribs. I'd expected my parents' attack. I hadn't expected my sister's knife in my back. Memories of late nights when she called me for help, the times I covered for her mistakes, the money I slipped into her account without asking, it all twisted into a single bitter taste. I forced my hands flat on the desk, steady, soldier steady. She sided with them. The words came out low, almost flat, because if I let emotion in, it would tear me open. Daniel didn't flinch. Your parents aren't playing small. And your sister, she just made herself a key witness. They want to erase your claim completely. Erase me completely. For a second, I stared past Daniel at the city skyline through his window. Denver's high-rises cut clean lines into the morning sky, as sharp as blades. My family thought they could redraw the map of my life, rewrite my place, strip my name. I turned back, my voice cool but iron underneath. Then we don't just defend, we dig in, and we find out why Anna would do this. Daniel gave a short nod. Good. We'll prep for mediation, but understand, this isn't just legal, it's personal. They want you gone. I rose from the chair, gathering the file with careful precision, the way I'd once packed gear before a deployment. Outside, the sunlight hit the glass buildings like fire. I walked back to my truck with one thought locked in my chest like a round chambered in steel. Family could rewrite papers, but not history, and I wasn't about to let them turn me into a ghost while I was still breathing. The first strike had landed, and it wasn't from my parents. It was from the sister I once thought I'd protect. I hadn't slept right in 2 nights. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel sliding that affidavit across the table, my sister's name printed neat and clean at the bottom, like she'd been waiting her whole life to sign against me. By morning, the weight of it was unbearable, so I drove. The suburban streets east of Denver were washed in pale sun, trimmed lawns, and children's bikes scattered across driveways. The kind of quiet that mocked me. I'd fought through deserts and jungles where silence meant danger, but this silence felt heavier, like every neat little mailbox whispered I didn't belong here. The folder sat in the passenger seat again, unopened, though I didn't need to read it anymore. I knew every word. Her townhouse was modest, a 2-story with beige siding and a blue front door. I parked out front and sat for a moment, hoping, ridiculous as it sounded, that maybe she hadn't meant it. Maybe there was some explanation I hadn't considered. A sister didn't just cut you down in writing, not without a reason. When the door finally opened, she stood there holding it halfway, her hair unbrushed, a sweatshirt slipping off one shoulder. "Maddie," she said, not warm, not cold, just flat. Inside, the place smelled of reheated casserole, Toys littered the living room floor, a plastic fire truck overturned near the sofa. I took it all in, ordinary life on display, while my own world spun like a tribunal waiting to strip me of my name. We sat at her kitchen table. The laminate top was scratched, coffee rings staining the surface. She fidgeted with a spoon, not meeting my eyes. I didn't waste time. Why? The word came out harder than I intended. Why would you sign against me? She flinched, then tried to smooth it over with vague lines. It's complicated. I thought it would keep the peace. Maybe you misunderstood the arrangement about the house. I cut her off. Misunderstood. I have letters. I have Dad's words in writing. You think I imagined all that? Her spoon clinked against the table, fingers trembling just slightly. For a moment, I thought she might cry, but then she drew in a breath and stared at me with something closer to defiance. All right, she whispered. You want the truth? I nodded once. They've been helping me, Maddie, for years. The mortgage, the credit cards, the kids' school stuff. Without them, I wouldn't make it. She swallowed, voice breaking. I didn't sign because I hate you. I signed because I can't lose that. I can't risk my children losing their home. The words hit harder than artillery. I leaned back, chest tight, as the realization crystallized. This wasn't just loyalty. It wasn't about emotions or misunderstandings. It was bought. A bargain struck behind my back. My own parents had built her cage out of cash, and she'd chosen to stay inside it. You sold me out for comfort, I said, my voice low, shaking with restrained fury. Her eyes flashed. Don't you dare. You chose the army. You chose a life where danger gave you medals and distance gave you rank. I didn't have that luxury. I chose survival. Don't judge me for not being you. Her words came like slaps. I stood too quickly, the chair legs scraping the floor. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out whatever else she tried to say. The house blurred behind me as I yanked open the door and stepped into the sunlight. My boots struck the pavement hard, each step an effort to hold back the explosion inside me. By the time I slammed my car door, my hands were trembling. I stared at myself in the rearview mirror. My face looked older, harder. For a long moment, I just breathed, then whispered, They aren't just erasing me. They're building an army against me, one family member at a time. I turned the ignition, jaw set. Defense wasn't enough anymore. If their loyalty had a price, I needed to know what else my parents had already purchased. The courthouse smelled like old paper and cold marble. I had been here before, but this time it felt different. Last week's confrontation with my sister had left me hollow, raw. She had chosen survival over me. Now I needed to see for myself what the paper trail looked like, what story my parents' lawyer was spinning, and how my family had been recruited to play their parts. I pushed through the glass doors, my heels clicking against the marble floor, the echoes ricocheting like accusations. The sunlight pouring through the tall windows couldn't warm the air. It only made the space feel sterile, clinical. Each step down the hallway felt like a march into enemy territory. I told myself I wasn't afraid, but my chest was tight and my palms were damp. In combat zones, at least you could see the threat. Here it was buried under ink and signatures. When I turned the corner, a familiar voice broke the silence. Maddie Thorne? I blinked. Standing near the clerk's office was a man I hadn't seen in years. Tom Keating, a former JAG officer I'd once served with overseas. His hair was more gray now, his suit a little rumpled, but his handshake was steady, his eyes sharp. Tom? I managed, stunned. Didn't expect to run into you here, he said with a faint smile. What's going on? For a moment I hesitated. Then something inside me cracked. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the simple relief of seeing someone who knew me outside of this family mess. I told him briefly about the trust, the affidavits, my sister's betrayal. He listened, jaw tightening. I left JAG a few years ago. Now I do civilian cases here in Denver. If you've got documents, I can take a look. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of safety. We sat together at a long oak table in one of the side rooms, stacks of files spread between us. The paper smelled of toner and dust. I flipped through affidavits, statements supposedly written by my own blood, my sister's name on the page. But the words, they didn't sound like her. "She says you're reckless with money," Tom muttered, scanning one affidavit. "That you've abandoned the family before, that you don't understand financial responsibility because you've spent your life in the army." "That's not her voice," I said sharply. "My sister doesn't talk like this. She barely knows what a liquid asset is." Tom looked at me, then at the pages again. He tapped a paragraph with his pen. "This isn't layman's writing. This is legal phrasing, crafted, not spoken." The room seemed to tilt. He pulled another affidavit closer. "See here, multiple documents use identical wording. Your parents' lawyer drafted these. They handed them to your family members and they just signed." I felt the air squeeze out of my lungs. So it wasn't just my sister choosing survival. It was manipulation, entrapment. My parents hadn't just divided us emotionally. They had built a case with precision, cutting me out with words my family didn't even write. A fury welled up inside me, sharp and clean. Years of discipline kept me from slamming my fist on the table. I had faced insurgents with less rage than this. "So they want to paint me as unfit," I said quietly. "An irresponsible soldier who abandoned her family." Tom nodded grimly. "They're turning your service into a weapon against you." My throat burned, but my voice stayed steady. "Then I'll fight back." He raised an eyebrow. "Not like this," I added, gesturing to the lies stacked between us. "I'll build my own case. Military records, financial statements, testimony from people who actually know me. If they want a war in court, they'll learn what it means to fight one." By the time I walked out of the courthouse, the sun was already dipping behind the Denver skyline, casting long shadows across the streets. I sat in my car, the weight of the documents pressing against my passenger seat. For a moment, I caught my own reflection in the rearview mirror, eyes hard, mouth set. "They had turned my service into a weapon against me," I whispered. "But I'm not about to fight empty-handed." The engine roared to life, but my war was only beginning. The apartment was too quiet when I walked in. The hum of the fridge, the occasional groan of pipes, those sounds pressed louder than artillery ever had. I set the files down on the kitchen table, their corners spreading like a fan of unfinished business. Paper-clipped affidavits, copies of trust documents, and my own scribbled notes stared back at me. This wasn't a battlefield of mud and wire. It was worse. Silence sharpened betrayal like a knife. I leaned against the counter, palms flat on cold laminate, and breathed. Out there in the courthouse, I could still pretend I was a soldier, braced, upright, armored. But in here, with no uniform and no rank to shield me, the loneliness was absolute. My own family had drafted me as the enemy. I pulled my phone from the charger. For a long minute, I just held it, staring at the names in my old contacts list. Men and women I had trusted with my life overseas. Would they still trust me now, when the fight was this strange, this personal? The first call rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Captain Maddie? God, it's been years." Warmth threaded the line, carrying me back to desert nights when we'd traded rations for stories. Relief swelled. Someone still remembered me without suspicion. The second call was different, polite but guarded. "I heard things," the voice admitted carefully. "Your family's been reaching out." My chest tightened. Already the poison was spreading. I forced myself steady, thanked them anyway, and moved down the list. One by one, I dialed, bracing for whatever version of me they'd been fed. Some answered with laughter and old camaraderie. Others offered only silence long enough to cut. Each call reminded me, trust had to be rebuilt, brick by brick, word by word. By the third evening, I found myself staring at a number I hadn't dialed in a decade. Colonel James Rollins, mentor, hard as iron, steady as oak Rollins, who once told me medals mattered less than the scars behind them. He answered on the first ring. Maddie. Just my name, low and certain. The years folded away. I told him everything, the trust, the lawyer, the lies wrapped in neat affidavits. He listened without interrupting, then said, "Paper trails win wars when bullets can't. You know that. Gather yours." Let them drown in their own fabrications. His voice was a lifeline. Fragile hope flickered back to life. If Rollins believed I could fight this, maybe I could. But hope cracked the next night. I had called Sergeant Hill, the one who once carried me out when shrapnel pinned my leg. If anyone would stand without wavering, it was him. At first, his voice held the same steady warmth I remembered. Then it broke. "Maddie, I need to tell you something. Your family's lawyer, he came to me, said you abandoned duty, abandoned family. He wanted me to sign a statement. They made it sound like you were reckless. I haven't signed, but..." His breath shuddered through the phone. "They're pushing hard." The room seemed to tilt. Betrayal wasn't new, but this was rot pushed into the past, reaching through loyalty I had bled beside. My hands clenched around the phone. Rage surged, then flattened into the calm my training drilled into me. Control it. Don't let it control you. "Thank you for telling me," I said, voice steady though my insides burned. That's all I needed to know. When the call ended, I set the phone down and stared at the mess of papers on the table. My family thought they could script my life into failure, that they could twist voices of the people who had once shouted my name over gunfire. I wouldn't beg for loyalty. I would prove the truth. I pulled out a fresh notepad, began listing deployment records, financial statements, commendations, rosters of missions. Names of comrades still willing to stand. Evidence, not sentiment, would be my shield. Each word steadied me, turned raw betrayal into fuel. By midnight, the wall above my desk had transformed. Photos, copies of documents, strings of red yarn pinned between names and dates. It looked like a war map, the kind intelligence officers drew before an offensive. Only this war was against blood. I stood back, breathing hard, and whispered to the empty room, "If they want to weaponize my silence, I'll weaponize the truth." The silence didn't answer, but it didn't scare me anymore. It was just the pause before battle. The courthouse archives smelled of paper dust and old coffee. I'd been there for hours, hunched under the flickering fluorescent light, scrolling through reels of microfilm and squinting at digital scans. Rows of manila folders were stacked on my table like sandbags before a storm. Once I fought wars under desert suns. Now my battlefield was paperwork. Deeds, affidavits, and trust agreements written in the kind of legal language meant to lull the inattentive. I told myself this was no different than patrols. Every line of text was terrain, every detail was cover or ambush. My service had trained me to notice what others missed, and now that discipline was the only thing holding me upright. By late afternoon, I'd found something. At first, it was only a smudge of unease, the same property listed twice, once in 2013 and again in 2015, but with different owners' signatures. The dates didn't align with reality. One fell on a week I knew for certain I was deployed overseas. The ink of betrayal as sharp as any bullet. My jaw clenched. This wasn't carelessness, it was deliberate. I copied the files, hands shaking but steady enough to press each page flat against the scanner. They wanted me erased quietly, the kind of vanishing you couldn't protest against because it was buried in paperwork. My own family had set the ambush while I wore a uniform halfway across the world. Later that week, I met Sergeant Hill at a corner cafe downtown. The place was small, noisy with the hiss of espresso machines, the air thick with cinnamon. Hill walked in, shoulders as broad as ever, eyes cautious but steady. We hadn't spoken in years, but when he sat across from me, the silence wasn't hostile, it was familiar, the kind forged in dirt and dust. "I read your message," he said. His voice was low, almost drowned by clinking cups. "You think they're trying to cut you out legally?" "They already did," I whispered, sliding a copy of the trust across the table. "But I need you to stand with me, not out of loyalty to me, but to the truth." Hill studied the paper, then me. After a long silence, he nodded once. "We stood together in war. We stand together now." Relief washed through me, thin but real. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel entirely alone. That night in my apartment, the glow of the laptop burned into my eyes. I flipped through digital copies again, line by line, until something new froze me cold. An amendment signed in 2011 when I was in Iraq. It wasn't just a technical adjustment, it was a surgical strike. The amendment explicitly removed my name from the inheritance. The signature line bore my father's looping pen stroke, the witnesses' familiar family friends. My stomach turned. They hadn't just insulted me at dinner tables or dismissed me in casual conversations. They had erased me in law on purpose while I was serving my country thousands of miles away. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was like staring at a folded flag, except this was no honor. It was burial by ink. But I didn't collapse. I forced my hands to steady, to print every page, to mark every date. If they thought silence would break me, they'd forgotten who I was. My resolve hardened like steel cooling in fire. I sketched a plan, gathered deployment orders showing I was overseas when the amendment was signed, line up affidavits from commanding officers, dig into handwriting analysis. Every lie left a trail, and I would follow it. I pinned the amendment to the center of my wall map and circled it in red marker. It glared back at me like a target. "They erased me with ink," I murmured. My voice didn't tremble. "I'll return with fire." The apartment no longer felt like exile. It was my command post, and the first counterstrike had begun. They had drawn first blood in court. But every counterstrike has consequences, and theirs was about to come crashing back at me. The courthouse always smelled of polished wood and old dust, as if every betrayal ever sworn inside had soaked into the grain of the benches. I walked through the marble halls that morning with my head high, though the echo of my boots betrayed the tremor in my chest. The Denver County Courthouse wasn't a battlefield in the desert, but the silence of those halls felt deadlier than any mortar round I'd dodged. Out there, enemies at least showed themselves. In here, they wore the faces of my blood. When I reached the courtroom, I caught sight of them, my parents seated together with their attorney. My father's posture was ramrod straight, his suit too neat, his expression unreadable. My mother leaned close to whisper in his ear, the corner of her mouth lifting in something that might have been a smile, or maybe a smirk meant for me. For half a heartbeat, I almost saluted them the way I had my commanding officers, out of sheer habit. Then I remembered. They weren't my superiors anymore. They weren't even my family. I sat beside Daniel, my attorney, whose tie was crooked in that way that made him look more like a soldier than a lawyer. He didn't waste words. He just leaned close and murmured, "Steady as you go. Today, you don't need to win, you just need to survive the first volley." The judge called us to order. Papers shuffled, pens clicked, and the air tightened. My parents' attorney rose first, his voice smooth as oil. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is about responsibility abandoned. My client's daughter chose a path of instability, absence, and emotional volatility. She left her family behind and now seeks to claim what she neither tended nor earned." Every syllable landed like a bullet, clean and rehearsed. I kept my face still, but inside, heat crawled up my throat. Unstable, absent, unworthy. The words weren't accusations, they were executions, meant to erase not just my rights but my existence. Daniel didn't flinch. He scribbled a note and slid it toward me. Let him overreach. I forced my hand to unclench on my knee. This wasn't the time to charge. It was the time to watch, to wait. My mother wouldn't look at me when our eyes almost met. She turned her head, adjusting a brooch on her lapel as though the shine of it mattered more than her daughter sitting 30 feet away. My father stared past me like I was just another shadow in the room. That void, that nothingness, it carved deeper than the lawyer's words. I'd braced for anger. I hadn't braced for erasure. Then the clerk called for the first witness. I thought I was ready. I wasn't. Claire. My sister walked to the stand with her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, the same way she'd worn it at her high school graduation. She gripped the Bible like it might burn her if she let go. Her voice trembled as she swore to tell the truth. When she opened her mouth, it wasn't truth that came out. It was the family's script. "She chose the army over us," Claire said. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. She never called, never cared. We were left to pick up the pieces while she played soldier. The air in the courtroom shifted. My chest tightened as though someone had reached in and snapped the last tether holding me upright. Claire wasn't just repeating lies, she was condemning me with them. My baby sister, the one I used to carry piggyback across muddy fields, was now the family's weapon. For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. My training told me to compartmentalize, to lock down emotion, but this was a hit no armor could absorb. Daniel's hand brushed mine under the table. "Stay with me," he whispered. I nodded once. Focus, evidence, not emotion. When it was our turn, Daniel asked for permission to submit deployment records into evidence. Pages slid across the bench, orders stamped, signed, dated. Proof that when the so-called amendment had been signed, erasing my name from the family trust, I was halfway across the world in Iraq. I finally spoke, my voice steady, colder than I felt inside. If they wanted me gone, they should have faced me, not forged me away. The words hung in the air. My sister's shoulders hunched as if they pressed on her too. For the first time that morning, my parents' lawyer's smile faltered. The judge's gavel cracked down. Enough. Both sides, remember, perjury carries consequences. I will not tolerate fabrications in my courtroom. That single warning slid like a crack through the polished armor of their case. Their lawyer adjusted his tie, his face a shade paler. My parents didn't move. My mother's nails dug into her purse strap. My father kept his eyes forward, as though he hadn't heard. When the session adjourned, I stood. My legs were steady, though my heart was shaking loose in my ribs. I walked past them, past my mother's perfume, past my father's cologne, past my sister's trembling silence, and I didn't look back. They thought today broke me. But in truth, today forged me. Outside, sunlight hit my face like the desert dawns I once knew. Grief coiled tight in my chest, but underneath it burned something fiercer. They think I'm cornered. They have no idea how dangerous I've just become. The key turned in my lock with the sound of metal scratching metal, the kind of noise that always seemed too loud for the narrow hallway. I stepped inside and let the door swing shut behind me. The familiar hum of the refrigerator filled the quiet, steady, and indifferent. My boots stayed by the door, unlaced. The apartment smelled faintly of old coffee and detergent, the evidence of mornings I hadn't had the energy to clean. I dropped my bag on the table, letting the strap fall with a soft slap against the wood. For a moment, I just stood there staring at the clutter, unopened mail, half-folded laundry, a stack of case files my attorney had left me. The walls seemed thinner than usual, the ceiling lower. This wasn't a home, not really. It was a checkpoint, a temporary station where I tried to hold the line between what was left of me and everything they were trying to take. The silence didn't comfort me. It pressed down, heavy and absolute. I sank into the couch and pressed my palms to my eyes. Claire's voice rang in my ears, clear as if she were still sitting on that witness stand. She always chose the army over us. She was never really part of this family. I had fought enemies on 3 continents, but nothing had hit me harder than hearing those words in my sister's mouth. Did she believe it? Or had they fed it to her until she thought it was truth? I wanted to believe she was forced, manipulated into repeating their lines, but part of me feared she meant every word, and that fear gnawed more than any courtroom insult. A knock pulled me out of the spiral. 3 soft raps. When I opened the door, Mrs. Ortega from across the hall stood there, cardigan wrapped tight around her frame. Her eyes darted down the corridor before she leaned closer. "Mija," she whispered. 2 men came earlier. Suits. They spoke with Mr. Keene, the landlord. Long talk. Quiet voices. The chill that ran through me wasn't from the draft. Did they say who they were? She shook her head. But it didn't feel right. I thought you should know. I thanked her, forced a smile, and closed the door gently. My chest tightened. Suits. Whispering with my landlord. My parents had decided the courtroom wasn't enough. They wanted me cornered everywhere. The confirmation came less than an hour later. A sheet of paper slid under my door, folded once. I picked it up and unfolded it under the yellow light of the kitchen. Administrative review of lease agreement, claims of recurring disturbances, delinquent rent payments, lies stacked neatly in bullet points, each one designed to uproot me. My hand trembled, then steadied. I muttered to the empty room, "If they can't erase me in court, they'll erase my home." For a minute, I just stood there, staring at the paper, feeling the heat rise in my face. They wanted me unsettled, unstable, cracked open by exhaustion, but I'd lived through barracks inspections at dawn, ambushes at dusk, and deployments where a wrong report meant a soldier's death. Paper couldn't scare me. I sat at the table, switched on my laptop, and pulled up bank records, rent payments all on time, receipts scanned and saved. I began drafting a letter contesting every accusation, citing dates, attaching documents. My keystrokes were steady, almost rhythmic. It felt like writing after-action reports at 3 a.m, exhausted but precise. Facts were my shield then, and they were my shield now. When I finished, the anger hadn't left, but it had form, direction. I leaned back in the chair, rubbing the stiffness from my neck. My phone lay on the table. Claire's name glowed on the screen, waiting. I hesitated, then hit call. It rang and rang and rang. No answer. The voicemail tone beeped. "Claire," I began, my voice catching on her name. I forced myself to breathe. "One day, you'll see what they're doing. Not just to me, to you too. They're breaking us both. And when that day comes, I'll still be your sister." I ended the call before my voice cracked again. Midnight crept up, quiet and merciless. I pulled a chair to the window and sat, staring out at the Denver skyline. The city lights blinked against the dark like distant watchfires, scattered but steady. "They've turned every room, every paper, every corner of my life into a battlefield," I whispered to the glass. "But they've forgotten. I've survived worse wars." The words hung there, part vow, part reminder. And somewhere in the quiet, I believed them. I had been in war zones that felt less hostile than this law firm's lobby. The polished marble floors reflected light in sterile streaks, the air conditioning hummed with surgical precision, and every wall seemed designed to make you feel small. I caught my reflection in the mirrored elevator doors, jaw tight, shoulders squared, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. Mr. Daniels, my attorney, was waiting near the reception desk with a folder tucked under his arm. His voice was even, clipped, like a drill instructor who didn't want to spook his recruit. "Stay calm," he said as we walked. "They'll try to rattle you. That's the game." I nodded, though my hands were already shaking. I clenched them into fists until the knuckles turned white. The conference room looked more like an operating theater than a place for words. Long mahogany table, black leather chairs, a pitcher of water sweating onto its tray. At the far end sat my parents' lawyer, flanked by 2 assistants tapping on laptops. My parents sat off to the side, stiff as stone, their faces masks I knew too well. The deposition began with the sterile click of the recorder. The lawyer leaned forward, his tone rehearsed. "State your full name for the record." "Maddie Thorne." And then it began, a barrage of questions about my finances, my health, my service, each query twisted, repeated, reshaped, designed to make me stumble. "Have you ever missed a rent payment?" "No." "Are you currently employed?" "Yes." "And yet your savings appear depleted. Why?" "Legal fees," I said, my voice flat. It went on like that, each question pressing harder, searching for cracks. I recognized the rhythm. It was interrogation disguised as inquiry. The point wasn't truth, it was pressure. And then the blow came. The lawyer slid a folder across the table. Photocopied pages fanned out before me, each marked with my handwriting. My throat closed. I didn't need to read them. I knew them by touch, by the ache in my chest. They were letters, raw notes I had written during my first year home from deployment, when the nightmares wouldn't stop and the bottle was my only sleep. I had kept them locked in a cedar box in my old bedroom. No one else had ever seen them. My heart pounded so hard I thought the recorder might pick it up. "These writings suggest a pattern of instability," the lawyer said smoothly, tapping one page where I had scrawled, "I don't know if I'll make it to morning." He looked at me over his glasses, waiting. And in that instant, I knew, Claire. Only she would have had access. Only she could have turned a key, rifled through that box, handed over my wounds like ammunition. "She gave them my wounds," I whispered, almost to myself. The lawyer pounced on the silence, pressing further, twisting every line into proof I was reckless, unfit, unreliable. My parents sat silent, complicit, letting my own words bleed me dry. Something in me snapped. I straightened, forcing the tremor from my voice. Those were recovery notes. Evidence of healing, not collapse. I let my gaze sweep across the room. "You want to make them my present? Then explain why I'm sitting here, working, paying rent, fighting back. If I were the person those pages describe, I wouldn't be alive for you to question." Mr. Daniels gave me the smallest nod, the only encouragement I'd see all day. But then my father smirked. Just a small curl of the lip, as if I were a child again, reaching for a seat I hadn't earned. My palm slammed down on the table before I even thought about it. "Do you think I'm still 17? I demanded, voice shaking but loud. "Begging for a seat at your table. I'm not anymore." Silence blanketed the room. Even the lawyer blinked, momentarily thrown. I felt my pulse roaring in my ears, but I didn't look away. I wanted them to see me, not broken, not begging, furious and unyielding. Hours later, the deposition ended. My body felt hollowed out, every nerve raw. I stepped outside and the Denver sunlight hit me like a weapon, blinding, relentless. The city moved on as if nothing had happened, as if my life hadn't just been gutted and dissected. "They've turned my own blood against me," I muttered, the words catching in my throat. "But this isn't over." I walked toward the parking lot, drained but still upright, each step a vow that I would not let them write the ending of my story. I sat on the couch in my dim little rental, a stack of legal papers spread across the coffee table like a deck of poisoned cards. 3 days had passed since the deposition, but my body still carried its weight, like the fluorescent lights of that conference room had seeped into my bones. Every page in front of me seemed to whisper my parents' accusations back at me. Unstable, reckless, unfit. The phone buzzed, once, twice, a number I recognized, someone from church, someone from the neighborhood, maybe even a veterans group. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Words from other people felt like demands now, even if they were just meant as kindness. My chest was too tight for conversation. The silence stretched until a knock startled me. I dragged myself to the door. "Mi hija." Mrs. Alvarez stood there, her small frame balanced against a plastic container of tamales. "You look like you haven't eaten in days." I started to tell her I was fine, but my throat caught. She pressed the warm container into my hands anyway. "You don't have to fight everything alone," she said softly, as if she'd read my mind. "Even soldiers need backup." When she left, the house felt less suffocating. I sat at the kitchen table, the scent of masa filling the air, and for the first time in days I actually ate. Just a few bites, but enough to remind me I was still here. The next morning, I met Daniels at a cramped coffee shop downtown. He looked like he hadn't slept either, his tie crooked, his eyes bloodshot. "They're pressing hard," he said, stirring his cup. "We need more than just your testimony. Hard evidence. Witnesses, if possible." I shook my head. "Who's going to stand against my parents? Claire won't. The rest of the family won't." He leaned forward. "Then we look outside the family. Service records. Commendations. Anything that establishes your stability and credibility. Otherwise, their narrative sticks." His words left a bitter taste in my mouth, stronger than the burnt coffee. Stability. As if survival itself hadn't been proof enough. By afternoon, I found myself parked in front of the Veterans Resource Center. My palms were slick against the steering wheel. I hadn't walked into a place like this in years. Too many memories, too many ghosts. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, but the welcome was warmer than I expected. A woman at the front desk looked up, her face breaking into recognition. "Maddie?" I remember you from the orientation talks years ago. You led one, didn't you? I nodded, throat tight. She gestured me in. You know, a lot of folks keep in touch here. Some even keep old mission records. It might help to reconnect. Reconnect. The word felt like opening a wound. Still, I scribbled my name on the visitor sheet and walked down the hall. That's when I heard it. Someone calling my name. Maddie? I turned. A man with broad shoulders and a weathered face stepped forward, hesitation flickering in his eyes. Harper? My voice caught. David Harper? It had been years since deployment, but I'd know him anywhere. We sat together in the lounge, awkward silence stretching until Harper reached into his bag. He slid a folder across the table. I kept copies, he said. Mission reports, commendations. Some of them mentioned you by name. Hell, you saved my ass more than once. I thought you should have these. I opened the folder. The words swam before me, phrases like exceptional leadership, stabilizing influence under fire, commended for resilience, none of which my parents' lawyer had shown, none of which I'd ever been given. They're saying you were unstable, Harper muttered, shaking his head. Bullshit. I saw you hold the line when everyone else was falling apart. My fingers trembled on the pages. Proof. Not memories, not feelings. Proof. A flicker of something stirred in my chest. Hope. We stepped outside afterward, the Denver air crisp with late afternoon sun. Harper leaned against the railing, eyes distant. I left the unit broken, he admitted quietly. Never thought I'd crawl out of that hole. But you, Maddie, you were the one who never quit. I should have told you back then. I swallowed hard. You don't owe me anything. Maybe not, he said. But if you're fighting now, you won't be fighting alone. The words hit deeper than I expected. For a moment, we didn't need to say more. The silence between us wasn't heavy. It was steady, like two soldiers sharing the same foxhole again. That night, I drove home with the folder on the seat beside me. I carried it inside, placed it on the table, and sat staring at it in the half-dark. My heart beat faster, not with fear this time, but with the fragile rhythm of possibility. I touched the cover lightly, as though it might vanish. Maybe the truth isn't buried after all, I whispered. And for the first time in weeks, I believed it. The Denver courthouse smelled faintly of varnished wood and stale coffee, but to me it carried the weight of a battlefield. I walked down the aisle with my head high, Harper's folder pressed against my ribs like a shield. Every eye seemed to follow me, gauging whether I'd stand or shatter. My parents' attorney stood with smug assurance, his voice smooth as he repeated the same poisonous refrain. I was unstable, reckless, incapable of managing my own life. He called me a liability to myself and others, a daughter unfit for trust. I sat still, my jaw clenched, each word landing like a blade, but instead of bleeding, I sharpened. Let him speak. Let him dance in the illusion they had built. Because in a moment, I was going to burn it down. When my attorney rose, his tone was crisp. No wasted words. He slid the reports from Harper across the polished table and into the judge's hands. Authentic military commendations, service records, and evaluations, he said firmly. The judge adjusted her glasses, scanning the pages. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom as she read aloud phrases like exceptional leadership under fire, commendation for valor, stabilizing force in crisis. The words rang louder than any accusation. My chest tightened with a strange mix of relief and fury, relief that the truth was finally breathing air, fury that it had been buried so long. Across the aisle, my father's face blanched. My mother's hand fluttered nervously at her throat. Their story, polished and rehearsed, began to splinter under the weight of undeniable fact. Then came the desperation. "This is a fabrication," my father barked, rising from his chair, his finger stabbing the air in my direction. "She forged them. She's always been a liar." The judge's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. "Sit down, Mr. Thompson. One more outburst and you'll be held in contempt." The courtroom's mood had shifted. Where once my parents commanded sympathy, Now they radiated arrogance and deceit. I sat straighter, every beat of my heart like a drum of vindication. And then, just when I thought the storm had reached its peak, Claire stood. Her chair scraped against the floor, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. "Your Honor," she said, her voice wavering but clear. I have something you need to hear." The room hushed. She pressed play. Static crackled, followed by my father's unmistakable voice. "We'll make her look unhinged. Push Claire hard enough, she'll break. She'll say whatever we want." Then my mother's laughter. "She'll never recover. By the time this is done, Maddie won't even have her name left." The words filled the chamber like poison gas, choking the very air. People gasped. Even the court stenographer's fingers froze. Claire's cheeks were wet with tears as she lowered the phone. "They made me lie," she whispered. "They threatened me. I'm so sorry, Maddie." The silence afterward was thunderous. The judge leaned forward, her gavel steady in her hand. "I've heard enough. This court rules unequivocally in favor of Madeline Thompson. Furthermore, I condemn the actions of her parents as malicious, deceitful, and profoundly damaging." Reporters surged as soon as the gavel struck finality. Cameras flashed. Questions flew. My parents sat pale and rigid, their empire of lies reduced to rubble in front of everyone they once sought to impress. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply breathed, the first full breath in years. Outside, the sun blazed against the courthouse steps. Claire approached cautiously, her arms folded as if shielding herself. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said softly. But I couldn't keep lying. Not anymore. I studied her, my sister, my betrayer, my reluctant ally. "You broke their chains today," I said. "That matters. But forgiveness, that's a longer road." She nodded, eyes downcast. And for the first time in years, we stood in fragile truth instead of weaponized silence. That night, in my quiet home, I set the military medals on the table beside the stack of dismissed legal papers. The fireplace crackled, flames licking the edges of the letters my parents had sent, each one dripping with venom. As the paper curled and blackened, I whispered to the empty room, "They tried to bury me, but I am still here, and louder than ever." Ash drifted upward, light as breath, carrying the weight of years into nothingness. And for the first time, I felt free. Looking back, I realized this fight wasn't only about winning in court, it was about reclaiming my voice, my dignity, and my right to stand tall no matter who tried to silence me. If there's one lesson I'd pass on, it's this. Family may be where wounds cut the deepest, but it can also be where resilience shines the brightest. Don't ever let lies, betrayal, or manipulation define who you are. Truth has power, and sometimes standing alone is the very thing that proves your strength. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a moment where standing up for yourself felt impossible, but you did it anyway? What gave you the courage? Share your thoughts below. I read every comment, and your stories inspire me as much as I hope mine inspires you. And hey, if this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments or let me know where you're watching from. If it didn't speak to you, tell me why. I want to listen. Wherever you're from, wherever you're watching, you matter here. If you found this video meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story. Together, we can keep building a space where truth, resilience, and hope are louder than fear.